All right, welcome, folks. So, Chapter 1, Social 9. Here we go. Giddy up, let's get moving. So, Chapter 1 is all about Canada's government, as the slide suggests. And in this particular presentation, what we're going to do, guys, is we're going to look at the structure of Canada's federal political system. And we're going to address three basic questions. Number one, we're going to discuss and understand what constitutions are, and they're beautiful. Number two, we're going to introduce the different branches of government, okay, not levels, but branches. We're not talking about municipal, provincial, and federal. We're talking about something different. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the role and responsibilities of these different government members, right? What their jobs are in terms of these branches. So let's get moving. Let's keep going here. So first of all, guys, constitutions. You've probably heard the term before, right? Constitution. So guys, Canada's original constitution dates back, of course, to 1867 with the British North America Act, also known as the Dominion Act. This act is what created the nation of Canada. Of course, before that, Canada was a British colony, and I guess technically speaking, we still are. But we've at least since our second constitution, known as the Constitution Act of 1982, might want to write that down. So with the Constitution Act of 1982, Canada gained the right to make constitutional amendments without the need to first consult the British government, right? To consult the Crown. So, guys, a nice little definition of the Canadian Constitution, or what a constitution is a constitution provides the fundamental rules and principles that govern a country. It creates many of the institutions and branches of government, and it also defines their powers. Now, probably the most important part, folks, of a constitution is this idea that it is the supreme source of law within a nation. What does that mean, Mr. Crosby? Well, basically, guys, what it means is that, you have this thing called the Constitution, which is above government, right? Government is confined by this thing called the Constitution. So essentially, guys, what a constitution does is it sets, as it suggests on the slide right here, it sets limits for government in terms of what it can do. And is that a good idea? Absolutely. And here's why. Setting limits on government is a good idea because governments are made up of people, and because people generally suck, right? And if you haven't had that experience yet, you will at some point in your life, right? People are corrupted. They are easily swayed by power. So we need these things called constitutions to set limits on what governments can do, because governments are simply made of people. And have people demonstrated a propensity in the past to make terrible decisions? Well, of course they have, right? The Nazis, the Bolsheviks, right? There's all sorts of historical precedent that suggest that human beings aren't exactly noble creatures. So it says, guys, in essence, governments bound by constitutions are limited in terms of what laws they can pass. So, guys, here's the cool thing. With this separation of powers that's set up by our Constitution, governments can't just pass any law they want. Like, for instance, in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it talks about things like religious freedom. Well, the government of Canada can't pass a law that says it's illegal for you to believe in Jesus Christ. They just can't do that, right? And all religions surrounding Jesus would be banned, right? Or it's illegal to be a Muslim. They can't do that. Buddhist, illegal. They can't do that, right? We have these things that are protected. So in essence, guys, the Constitution is like a rule book for government, and that's good, because the whole point here, folks, is to prevent tyranny. Tyranny is a situation where the government doesn't act in the best interest of the people, but instead they act in the best interest of themselves. And we don't want that, right? We don't want that. So, guys, constitutions are beautiful things. Now, we have this image here. I'm just going to move my little box down. So, guys, we have this image here of Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, father of current Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, sitting on the, what was it? I think the 17th of April, 1982, if I'm not mistaken. And he is sitting with the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, who of course is our head of state, and they're signing this thing called the Canadian Constitution, or the Constitution Act of 1982. So it's kind of interesting, guys. Like when you look at a lot of countries that achieved independence, right? A great example would be America. Of course, America, guys, declares their independence on the 4th of July, 1776, right? And they have a war against the British for their independence. The American Declaration of Independence is this beautiful breakup letter where the American colonists, who at that point were loyal British subjects, or at least up until that point were loyal British subjects, basically kind of did one of these to the British crown, right? And they're just like, nah, we don't want you anymore. Oh, that's nice. Sorry about the toilet flushing. There we go. Okay, so guys, despite the fact that Canada existed since 1867 as created by the British North America Act, it wasn't until 1982 did our current Constitution actually come into effect. So our Constitution is only 38 years old, right? If you do the math, okay, 2020 minus 1982, 2020 is the year in which I'm making this video. It's only 38 years old, so it is a relatively young charter. And guys, often, and please don't make this mistake, students think that Canada's Constitution is called the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that's not true. Canada's Constitution is called the Constitution. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a small subsection of it. There's parts of the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982 that date back to the British North America Act of 1867. There's parts of our Constitution that even date back as far as something called the Magna Carta of 1215. So in 1215, British subjects basically pressured their king to give them more rights. The term Magna Carta, by the way, is a Latin term that means great charter. Okay, so just so we're aware. So guys, please don't make that mistake of calling Canada's Constitution the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's not. Okay, it's just wrong, and you sound foolish. You sound ignorant when you say stuff like that. So just be aware, Canada's Constitution is called the Constitution. So here we have sort of a visual image of what I'm talking about here, right? So this thing called the Constitution Act of 1982, Canada's Constitution is a very vast document. And I've read and watched some videos where they suggest that no one actually knows what fully constitutes Canada's Constitution. So like I said, right, parts of the Magna Carta are entrenched in our Constitution Act. The British North America Act is entrenched in the Constitution Act, and also the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a beautiful document, and we will look at it very specifically when we get to the third chapter, is also in there. The charter is muy bueno, as my Spanish-speaking friends would say. So there's many things that make up the Constitution. All right, now, what about the structure of Canada's government? So guys, the structure of Canada's government is outlined by the Constitution Act of 1982. And it says, in addition to setting limits for government, which is what constitutions do, right? We mentioned that. They also help determine a framework for the structure of a nation's government. So Canada's structure, right, of our federal government is outlined by the Constitution Act of 1982. So here in Canada, guys, our Constitution helps set up something called separation of powers. Now, the word here is it entrenches the separation of powers. To entrench means to solidify, to like cement this structure and function of government. And the Constitution additionally also helps determine the responsibilities of the federal governments and also the provincial and territorial governments. So for instance, guys, in the Constitution, it mentions things like national security, right? That is a federal jurisdiction, whereas healthcare and education are provincial jurisdictions, right? And you can look that up. And as we need to know it, we will introduce those ideas, but they're not needed in this first presentation. All right. So separation of powers. So guys, most nations in the world use a variant of this thing known as separation of powers. So guys, separation of powers goes way back to a philosopher, an Enlightenment philosopher named Montesquieu, who wrote back in the 1700s, right? He wrote in the 18th century. So guys, this separation of powers that he proposed, which was adopted first by the Americans with their revolution against the British once they were successful, right? They had this separation of powers written into their constitution, was also adopted by France after their revolution in 1789, and most good liberal democracies, if not all, to be honest, use this model of separation of powers. Now, the question is, why? Well, guys, it has been demonstrated time and time again that when one person or one small group of people have power, it corrupts them. So there's a quote from Lord Acton, right? Who says, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You want an example of power corrupting people? Look at North Korea today. North Korea is a communist dictatorship that is ruled by one person, and that is a man by the name of Kim Jong-un. In Kim's North Korea, what he says goes, period. So guys, in a nation like Canada, Justin Trudeau can't simply do whatever he wants. In the United States, Donald Trump, thankfully, can't do exactly what he wants. And guys, you know, the government's not an extension of their will. They're but one person in a much more complex system of, and the term we like to use is checks and balances. So the whole point here, guys, again, is to prevent tyranny. When we distribute power amongst many people, when many people are used to make decisions, well, those decisions hopefully come and factor in the best interests of the people. So when one person has all the power, it turns into a dictatorship. And we don't want that, right? We don't want that. So instead, we distribute power. Now, according to this model, what are the branches that make up this idea of separation of powers? Well, there's three of them, okay? There's three of them. There's the legislative branch, and you should know what the job of the legislative branch is. To legislate means to make laws. So the legislative branch makes laws. And guys, law is this idea, sometimes called the social contract, that we, the people as a whole in a democracy, agree upon. So the legislative branch makes laws. Now, the second branch that we need to know is known as the executive branch. And their job is to propose laws and also rule according to the law. Okay, and we'll talk about who's in what branch as we move forward here. And then the last branch is the judicial branch of government. And I should mention, guys, the most important branch of all these is the judicial branch, and it needs to be independent. We want to make sure that we have an independent judiciary in our country, because we want to make sure that the court system, that's what we're talking about when it comes to the judicial branch. We want to make sure that the court system, whether it's the Supreme Court or the provincial courts, are ruling according to the law, not according to what powerful people in government want, right? Their job is to rule according to the law. So enforce those laws and also interpret those laws. So every country in the world, guys, has an executive branch, right? Like a president, prime minister, like here in Canada. and a legislative branch that makes laws, but not every country in the world has an independent judiciary. Case in point, China, right? China is a nation where there's one ruling party, the Chinese Communist Party, usually called the CCP. And guys, their court system, their judicial branch is simply an extension of what the Chinese government wants. Their leader, their executive, is a man by the name of Xi Jinping. Kind of looks like Winnie the Pooh. And guys, Xi basically rules by decree. What he says goes. Now, they also have a legislative branch, but they're just appointed basically in there to do exactly what the party represented by Xi says needs to happen. So there is no independent judicial branch. The court system simply does exactly what they're told by the executive branch of government. And as a result, guys, the court system in places like China or North Korea is used to punish people who are considered enemies of the government. And that's probably not a good thing, right? Because then people who speak out against government get punished. And guys, here in Canada, we can disagree. We can protest against our government. But in China, In North Korea, in the former Soviet Union, where they didn't have an independent judicial branch either, if you spoke out against the government, you were sent to gulags or prison labor camps, right? So this is a good thing that we here in Canada have an independent judiciary. So this is a model, guys, that looks at the Canadian separation of powers, right? It looks a little bit like what you saw in the Canvas pages subsequent to this, right? So in general, guys, look, you need to know basically who's in what branch. Okay, you just do. It's basic knowledge that you should have as a social studies student here in Alberta. That's delicious. Okay, so again, guys, legislative branch, Parliament, House of Commons, and Senate. We'll talk about them. The executive branch, Governor General and the Prime Minister. Underneath him, we also have the Cabinet and the Prime Minister's office. And then lastly, the judicial branch over here, Supreme Court. And then we have lower level courts, provincial courts, tax courts, and federal courts underneath it. Let's keep going. We're going to describe what each of these branches does. Again, let me move my little box down. Okay, so the legislative branch of government, guys, this is thought of as being the most important. Now, why? Because this is the branch that is of the people, at least in Canada when it comes to House of Commons, right? This is the branch that is of the people. In a democracy, it's supposed to be of the people, by the people, for the people, right? The government is of the people. We, the people, get elected to it. It is by the people. Again, we are the ones who are a part of it, and it's supposed to be for the people, right? So it's supposed to rule in the best interest, or the so-called will of the people. So anyways, guys, in Canada, the legislative branch is known as Parliament, hence why we see that right there. And there's two houses to our Parliament. So it's called a bicameral Parliament, bi meaning two, right? Like a bicycle, two wheels. And the legislative branch, guys, it consists of the House of Commons, also called the lower house. And in the House of Commons, we have these people called members of Parliament. Members of Parliament are elected to that governmental house, that body, okay? There's 338 of them because there's 338 constituencies across Canada from which they are elected. And then there's something called the Senate, or the so-called upper house of Parliament. And senators are non-elected. There's 105 of them, and their job is to be a house of sober second thought, right? That's the role of the Senate. Both of these houses can start legislation, right, or approve legislation. But with that being said, guys, typically it comes out of the House of Commons. So bills that are passed or introduced to the House of Commons by people inside there are called, or bills that originate in the House of Commons start with a C, right? Like C61, right? C meaning Commons. Sometimes bills are created by the Senate and those start with S, but it's very uncommon to see bills originate in the Senate. Why? Because those senators aren't elected. What right do they have to create legislation. Now, if they're not elected, Mr. Crosby, how are senators, how do they get their job? Well, they are appointed by the Governor General on the authority of the Prime Minister. Okay, so typically, guys, what happens with senators is if you're a good member of, let's say, the Liberal Party of Canada, because I'm just going to pick on them because they're the party in power right now. If you're a good member of the Liberal Party and let's say there's an election and you don't get voted in again, then the Prime Minister might appoint you to a senatorial position. And typically, guys, these positions are called patronage appointments. You've been a good little lapdog for me, the Prime Minister. As a result, I'm going to reward you with this cushy Senate appointment that pays you well, and you get to serve until you're 75 years old. Enjoy your taxpayer paid job until you're really, really old. So anyways, guys, the entire point of the legislative branch is to create legislation, right? To create laws. And guys, these laws are supposed to represent what we, the people, want, right? And a great example, guys, of laws would be, here in Alberta, they passed a law, and I know this is a provincial thing, but they passed a law surrounding distracted driving, right? Using your cell phone while you drive. Most people were like, wow, this is a problem. The will of the people in Alberta said that distracted driving is a problem. As a result, previous governments passed laws against distracted driving. Okay, so that's the legislative branch. So if you remember, their job is to pass laws, right? To pass legislation in the interest of the people to make our lives better, more safe, right? Then you're on point. Next, the executive branch of government. So the executive branch, guys, consists of the Governor General or the Queen, if she happens to be here in Canada, the Prime Minister, and also the Prime Minister's cabinet, right? So there we have it, the Queen or Governor General, the Prime Minister or the cabinet. Technically, guys, and don't forget this, the Queen is our head of state. It's not our Prime Minister. It is the Queen. For something to become law, in the end, it actually has to be finalized by a signature of the Queen or the Governor General, who's the Queen's representative when the Queen's not here. Now, guys, the primary function of the executive branch is to propose bills. Bill, what's that, Mr. Crosby? A bill, guys, is like a baby law, a law that hasn't reached puberty yet, I guess. Kind of a crude metaphor. But anyways, guys, a bill is a proposed law that hasn't gone through the legislative branch yet and been deliberated and argued about, and then finally have a vote on whether it should be passed or not. And we'll get into this in more detail. So guys, this idea of the executive branch. So all the laws that are created when a government's in session, they generally originate from the executive branch of government. Typically what happens is the Prime Minister or cabinet ministers will originate laws based on sort of what's the general mood of society at that time. So remember, guys, in a democracy, whatever most people want should be what government does, right? And a good example of that would be a law against cyberbullying, right? Like they could pass a law that introduces penalties into the Canadian Criminal Code that would be punishing to people who engage in cyberbullying. So yeah, it's accurate, guys, to say that the ruling party is more or less solely responsible for the legislative proposals within a nation. So all those laws that are passed when government's in session originate from this executive branch. But it's not like they can just pass whatever they want, because it has to enter into the legislative branch where they have a vote on it and it could pass or not. That's the beauty of democracy, right? We deliberate, we argue, we present arguments for the law, we present arguments against the law, and then finally they have a vote on it, and if it's believed that this law represents the will of most people, then it should pass. And if it doesn't, then it's going to get thrown into the garbage bin and never seen from again. All right, and then finally the last branch, guys, the judicial branch of government. The judicial branch of government consists of the Supreme Court of Canada, which is in Ottawa, and provincial courts, and then other courts as well, like tax and federal courts. Now, guys, the entire point of the judicial branch of government, its main function is to interpret and enforce laws passed by the legislative branch. So the way laws work, guys, is the executive branch proposes them, they enter into the legislative branch, they deliberate, they argue, and then if that bill is passed into a law, it is then the job of the judicial branch to interpret and enforce those laws made or passed by the legislative branch. So here's the cool thing, guys, about the judicial branch. They also have something called judicial oversight. So if a law is passed in the legislative branch, right, in the House of Commons, and it is not in line with the charter, or sorry, with the Constitution, they can actually rule that law that was passed as unconstitutional. And guys, this is the idea of what's called checks and balances in power. So their job, guys, the judicial branch, is to rule according to what the law says. And I mentioned earlier that the judicial branch must be independent. It has to be. If you don't have an independent judiciary, and this is why I'm arguing it's the most important out of them all, every country has an executive, every country has a legislative branch, but not every nation has an independent judiciary. We must have an independent judiciary. Now, guys, I mentioned earlier that Canada has this model we follow this model known as separation of powers, as first proposed by Montesquieu in the 1700s. So it's a tad simplistic to say, guys, that we have a total separation of powers, when in fact, what we have here in Canada, guys, is a fusion of powers. Now, this fusion of powers is unique to parliamentary systems of government. Okay, and I'll show you the American model here in a second. So this fusion of powers, guys, happens because there is overlap right here between the executive and the legislative branch of government. Notice how the legislative branch and the executive branch are actually connected. Now, why is that, Mr. Crosby? Well, if you were going through the Canvas material already, you would know. And the answer to that is, folks, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet are simply members of Parliament who represent the ruling party. The Prime Minister is he's just a member of Parliament who happens to be the leader that got the most seats in the previous election, right? In the most recent election. So you become the Prime Minister by being the leader of the party that gets the most seats in government. Now, how do you become a cabinet minister? Well, the Prime Minister chooses them, right? Based on your qualifications, based perhaps on your personal connection, based upon your education, your previous experience in another job, right? You might get appointed as a cabinet minister. So these guys, again, they're the ones who propose bills, but they also sit in the House of Commons and vote on those bills. So there's a fusion between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Now, this is neat, guys, because in places like America, where they don't use a parliamentary system of governance, they actually use a presidential model, right? Hence why we have a prime minister and they have a president. Weird, right? In the United States, it's a little bit different, right? You don't see this fusion. You will see the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and look at the judicial branch not connected to anything, totally independent. But in the US, you will see the judicial, executive, and legislative branches totally separate from each other. And that's what we see in this particular model. So here we have the legislative branch, and in the US, it's called Congress, not Parliament, right? We have the House of Representatives and then also the Senate, right? And they are separate from the executive. There is no overlap between them like what we see here, right? The president does not sit in the legislative branch of government. The vice president does not sit in the legislative branch of government. The cabinet of the executive in the United States does not sit in the legislative branch of government. And then, guys, of course, they also have an independent judiciary. Why? Because, like I said, it is the most important branch of government. So, what's the point here? Why do we have separation of powers. Well, hopefully by this time, right, we're 29 minutes into the video. I apologize, but I get excited about this stuff. So as mentioned previously, guys, the entire purpose of separation of powers is to ensure tyranny in government does not occur. That should say in government. I will fix that. Remember, guys, humans used to be ruled by kings and emperors. And those people had absolute power, right? There's this belief that they're chosen by God to rule over the people, this idea called the divine right of kings. And for the average person living underneath that king and that emperor, life was miserable. So separation of powers, guys, sets up a series of checks and balances on power. And that's really important. Separation of powers, having an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, sets up this system of checks and balances to make sure no one branch becomes, or one person becomes, all powerful. Because again, what happens when people get power? They get corrupted, right? So for power to be checked means it has limits. For it to be balanced means it's distributed amongst many. Again, we don't want too much vested in the hands of one person. What happened when Thanos got all the Infinity Stones? We don't want that, okay? Shout out to the Avengers. Okay, so a beautiful meme. I love memes. I use them lots. I one day hope that memes replace human language and we simply communicate rather than by talking with memes. So the classic, you see, Woody. And then, guys, just a really quick review, right? Going back to the first slide. The main focus of this presentation is, number one, to understand and discuss what constitutions are, right? We should now know that constitutions are limiting documents that prevent tyranny, and they also set up the structure and function of governments. You should know that, right? Constitutions are awesome. You should know the different branches of government, right? The executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch, and you should be able to describe the role and responsibilities of each of these different branches. The executive, they propose bills which become law, right? The legislative, they pass bills into law, and then the judicial, they interpret and enforce laws. Okay, that's a little intro to the Canadian government. Hopefully you found that enlightening. Hopefully you found that interesting. If not, I sincerely apologize, but hopefully it wasn't too bad. Okay, we'll see you in the next video. Okay, guys, peace.